morning. I would normally stand up here and say most of you already know me, but actually we've had a lot of new people over the past few months, so there probably are people in the room that don't know me. So if you don't know me, my name's Jane Gomarsall. I am married to Ralph in the red t-shirt down here, although he usually wears a yellow t-shirt, so if you're new, I'm sure you will have met him. I live in Camberley, and we do, as Chris said, have two sons, an amazing daughter-in-law, and this is the only and will always be the only dog in my house. Let me introduce you to Doggo. These last few months, couple of months, we've had the Jesus stories, and they've been stories that Jesus told to real people who lived in a real place about real things. These stories Jesus used to tell us about the things of the kingdom of God. They were both simple and yet profoundly deep. Jesus gave us pictures to help us remember things. So this morning, I'm going to be speaking on probably the most famous parable of all. I doubt there's anybody in the room who hasn't heard of the story of the two builders, one wise and one foolish. Before I read, I just want you to know a little snippet of information, which you may well know, but if you don't, it's really pertinent to what I'm going to say. Jesus tells this parable at the end of what we know as the Sermon on the Mount. So he'd been teaching for what could have possibly been a whole day, maybe more than that, out on a hillside, and he's given the people who've come to listen to him loads of information, loads of teaching. He's taught them about who he is and about what he's come to do and about who they are and what he requires of them. And I don't think it's insignificant that he concludes all of that teaching with this parable. So, the wise and the foolish builders. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Most of the weeks when somebody has stood up here, they've given us a little bit of an understanding of what was going on at the time when Jesus told these stories. So I'm going to do that. Like the other stories, this story was set in the 1st century in Judea or Israel. It was set in the time that Jesus lived, where most people couldn't read or didn't read. They didn't have free access to books, but they're incredible memories. It's likely the people who were listening to Jesus, most of them would have known and remembered, been able to recall vast swathes of the Old Testament. It's written to he spoke it to a people who lived in an agrarian society. So what they talked about were sheep and shepherds, wheat, weeds, fish, fishermen. If Jesus was on a beach, he talked to people about things that were there, nets and fishing. And likewise, I imagine that today, this story he spoke about to a people who lived in houses like this. I wonder if what had happened recently had been that there had been a huge storm and a house had collapsed, perhaps there'd been a massive amount of flooding. Jesus was so of the moment that it doesn't surprise me if that was what was going on. That was the background to why he told this story. I think actually, essentially, whilst this parable mentions houses and building, I think the underlying message here is not about that. I think the underlying message that Jesus wants us to hear this morning is about listening and doing. But we will come back to that. Because I think first we do need to talk about the building thing. And no, I'm not going to sing the song. Historical research has shown us that houses were probably something like this. They were undoubtedly made of stone for most people because it was easily accessible. They probably had wood and clay. Maybe they had roofs made of timber or even tiles. The area where Jesus lived was a region that is known to have had clay as one of its subsoils. So in the summer, it would have been baked hard as rock, and in the winter, it would have been, well, you know what clay's like when it gets wet, slushy and muddy. The hillsides around there were definitely rocky. There were some very tall mountains. Well, there still are, right, in Israel. So it's essential to build, if you're building a house like this, on a good foundation. You might have had to only dig down 10, 20 centimetres to get a good foundation, or you might have had to dig several metres deep. Jesus calls one of the builders wise, and he calls the other foolish. In the Bible, the word to be wise often means considered or thoughtful, prepared, if you like. So the word foolish often means somebody who is not like that. It's a conscious decision that someone has made to do the thing that is not wise or not sensible. So it leads me to believe that the foolish builder might have been building in a place that wasn't sensible to build. Have a look at this. That's what happens if you build in a place that's not that sensible, right? Both the men in this story were builders. They were both building a house. They were building somewhere for them and their family to live. Both the men's houses faced the storm, but they'd built in different places and on different foundations. Why do you think the builder who built on sand built there? Didn't he know it wasn't a good place to build? Surely, as he began getting his stone and digging down and doing all that foundation stuff, the people who lived around him were like, dude, why are you building there? That's not a good place to build. Do you not know what happened the last time someone built here? Why didn't he listen? Well, maybe he thought he knew better. Maybe he was in a hurry. Maybe it was too much hard work. That's a likely one. Too expensive, too far from B&Q. I don't know. Perhaps he was just taking the easy option. Maybe he thought, it'll be okay. I'll get away with it. That's a once-in-a-lifetime storm they're talking about. How often does that happen? Well, once in a lifetime. So perhaps that'll be fine for me. I think he thought, I'll get away with it. And he did, didn't he, for a while? Until the storm came, until the wind blew. He did get away with it. What about the wise builder? Well, I think he had a long-term plan. I think he was building a house for him and his family, and he wanted it to last. He was building for the future. He built in a place that was probably hard to build in. Probably took him a while. It was costly in time and in money. But he ended up with a really solid house. Why did Jesus tell people who were listening to him that story? And why is he telling it to us today? Well, the whole purpose of a parable, as I really hope you've understood over these past few weeks, is to be thought-provoking. It's meant to poke us a bit, say, what do you think about that? So this morning, I hope that you will consider yourselves poked, and you will have something to think about. I think Jesus is saying, listen to my words. If you want to be wise, he says, put my words into practice. What words? Well, the words we've already heard. For us in this room, we've had 11 weeks of words spoken over you, at you. For Jesus' listeners, they'd heard lots of teaching. So Jesus is saying, be like a wise man. Take all of that teaching, all of that information, and build it or put it into your life. Build for the long term. If you went to Sunday school, probably wasn't as good as our kids' zone, but if you did, I expect the teachers you heard talk about this parable probably talked about it as a parable about salvation, about how you come to know God and about why you should come to know God. And if you're listening to this and consider yourself as a follower of Jesus or a Christian this morning, please don't dismiss this parable as only being for somebody who doesn't yet know Jesus. It is about that. But remember, the audience that Jesus was speaking to were largely Jewish out on that mountain. They were people who considered themselves people of faith. He was challenging those with faith to talk about what he'd already spoken about. And I think that's what he's challenging us to do this morning, to think about all the things that we've already heard and talked about in this series. So my first big question for you, maybe? Well, you're going to get the question anyway. My first big question to you is, having heard all that you have heard, back one please. Having heard all that you have heard, what are you going to do about it? Well, what have you heard? Well, I will do a very brief recap. It's all out there on the YouTube thing, so you can listen them again if you want to. Drew talked about money. He also talked about being a good Samaritan. Dave Shepherd talked about stewarding what you have. Tim challenged us about being lost and found. Matt said, who are you reliant on? And are you ready for when Jesus returns? Dave Morgan talked about sowing seeds of the gospel everywhere we go. Chris McKinley talked about comparison. Lynn talked about living a life of persistent prayer. And last week, Julian spoke so eloquently about pride. As you listened, did you let Jesus' words go deep and impact you? Have you changed anything about your life because of what you heard? Are you listening to Jesus' stories and letting him change you to become more like him? To the original hearers, Jesus was increasing the difficulty of what it was like to be a person of faith. They already had more rules about how to be a person of faith than you could shake a stick at. They knew their Bibles inside out. As I've said, they probably learnt it and knew it off pat. But Jesus was challenging them with something more. He was saying, don't just do what the law requires. Don't just pray the prayers that are written in the prayer book. Actually become somebody who looks more like Jesus. Become somebody who talks more like Jesus. If Jesus lived in your house, worked in your office, had your neighbours, went to your gym or your school, if Jesus lived in 2022 in the Camberley, Farnborough area, what would he do? What would he do with his money? What would he do with the people that he was friends with? What would he do with the people around him who didn't yet know Jesus? Is your life being built so people know that you are a follower of Jesus? I hope that you are feeling challenged and poked this morning. Are you any different to those who live in the houses next to you? Having heard everything that Jesus has said, what are you going to do about it? My second big question. When the wind blows in your life, as it surely will your house of faith stand? Jesus said, in this world we will have trouble. None of Jesus' disciples led an easy life. They experienced, like you, pain, ill health, persecution, financial insecurity. They had friends who let them down. Their lives challenged people. They offended people. People walked away from them. They made people angry. And yet, by and large, because the New Testament tells us they lived radical, exciting, authentic lives. They experienced the supernatural miracles, and they saw hundreds, thousands come to know Jesus. Paul was blinded, shipwrecked, imprisoned, whipped, and eventually killed. John, Jesus' really special friend, he was hounded, persecuted, and exiled. The end of his life he spent in Patmos. And yet those first followers, their houses of faith stood firm. For them, it wasn't only about listening to what Jesus said. It was about doing something about it, about putting it into action. They weren't Sunday-only Christians. They didn't choose the easy option. They were good Samaritans. They were persistent prayers. They were people who were totally sold out and reliant on God. They sowed seed everywhere they went. They were younger, not elder brothers. For a lot of us in the room, we made the salvation choice, the choice to follow Jesus a long time ago. But have we stopped short of doing all that Jesus is asking us to do? Have we stopped listening in, leaning in, asking the question, Jesus, what are you saying? Jesus, what you want me to change? What do you want my life to look like? How can I be more like you? How can I speak more like you do? The ground sometimes gets hard when you've been a Christian a while. And maybe you've eased off digging. Maybe the storm of COVID has rocked you and you've decided to take a seat for a while instead of standing for Jesus. Yes, it's difficult what Jesus asks us to do. Not going to make any bones about that. But it's not impossible. It's not impossible because if it was impossible, Jesus wouldn't have asked us to do it. What he's asking you to do is not impossible, but it is difficult. So my third question, or perhaps this is your question to me, is how can I do what Jesus is asking of me? How can I put these parables into my life? How can I become more like Jesus? These parables certainly have shown us a hard way of living that doesn't come naturally. It's not easy to rely on Jesus sometimes. It's not easy to live a persistently prayerful life and make the right godly choices. The ultimate choice of letting Jesus save us and continue to do that. It's tough. Building is often tough. Actually, I know a bit about building. Not much about the actual doing, but I do know a bit about it. Because 3 years ago or so, Ralph and I bought a house. It needed a serious renovation. Actually, we had a very strong vision of what we wanted the house to be like. We had a budget, we drew up plans, we employed a builder, and we took what on the outside looked like a perfectly acceptable house that people could live in, and we ripped it apart, as you can see. We ripped it apart so that we could build it better. I well recall a very cold, dark February day, just depressing before I even walked into this house and what we'd done to it. The walls were down. There was no plaster on any wall that was left standing. There was no working toilet, no plumbing of any kind, definitely no heating. In fact, there were no electrical wires at all in the whole house. They'd all been ripped out. And it was depressing. A house that had previously looked like that it would function was now a shell, and no one could live there, especially not me. You know me well. But on a wall, as you went in, there was a spotted and stained piece of paper. It was a plan. It was the technical drawings of how we would achieve what we'd set out to. It showed me how far we'd come. It reminded me of what the end game was going to be. That it was, even though it didn't look like it right then, it was going to be a beautiful house. Probably more important even than those technical drawings was our builder. Remarkable, amazing man who oozed confidence and competence. And anyone who has done a similar project, who knows the joys and the desperations of building, will know the importance of a good builder. Because you know that you will get a phone call sooner probably rather than later that will say to you, we've just discovered X, Y, or Z. It's not been accounted for. It's not in the budget. I know there are some in the room that are going through this right now. So one day the builder called with the news that none of the downstairs windows had any lintels. So for the uninitiated in the room, a lintel is a large piece of concrete that runs across the span of the top of the window. They're sort of vaguely important because they keep the windows in, and they hold the bricks above the lintel in the wall. So important, right? Well, we didn't have any, apparently, none downstairs. So as I'm reeling from this revelation, he says in his calm and confident voice, "Oh, it's fine. It'll be okay. Don't worry. It's an unexpected cost, and it will delay the build, but it won't affect the end game." Our lives are so often filled with extra costs and interminable delays. I don't know what they look like for you, but I know you have them. In the story Jesus told, this is when the storm comes. This is the wind blowing. It's the unexpected, except it's to be expected. It's essential, in fact, because when the wind blows, you see where the gaps are. You see where the water's coming in, or where the wind can come through. And it enables you to put in place some provision to change, to build back better. And just in case you want to know, we do now have lintels in our windows. And if you come to see us, I assure you the walls won't fall down, because our builder did a remarkable job. And Jesus is offering us tools to help us build our house better, the house of our life. He offers us instructions. He offers us a plan. He gives us his Bible. But more than that, he gives us a hope of what the eternal future will hold. And if this morning you are going through a rocky period when the storm is blowing, hold on to that hope. Hold on to the end times, because know that one day, you saints, you will walk into a room, a whole house that God has prepared for you in heaven, and it will be awesome and amazing, just the plan that he has for you. Jesus offers us a master builder, an architect, a project manager. He is the one that holds our hands through the trials and tribulations of any building disaster. And he's the one who can help us put all of these parables into action in our lives. The Message translation or paraphrase of this parable says this: "These words I speak to you are not incidental additions to your life, homeowner improvements to your standard of living. They are foundational words, words to build a life on. If you work these words into your life, you are like a smart carpenter who built his house on solid rock. Rain poured down, the river flooded, a tornado hit, but nothing moved that house. It was fixed to the rock. Fixed to the rock of Jesus. Jesus' words are not comfortable, but you go into these renovations with him as the master builder, letting him get to your foundations, underpin your life, listening and doing to what he said. Perhaps you feel like you're a Jewish listener this morning, assuming you've got it sussed, that you'll be okay or you'll get by. But Jesus is calling us to a higher standard. He's calling us to go the extra mile, to up the ante. He's calling us to radically overhaul and renovate what our lives look like. Not an easy message, but he's calling us to take his words and build to a higher standard. Perhaps the band would like to make their way back up, because it would be very remiss of me if I didn't talk to those of you in the room who have not yet built their lives on this man, Jesus. Because this parable is definitely for you. If you have not yet built your life on Jesus, then this morning I would say to you, he is an incredible builder. And he longs to come and help you. So perhaps you this morning need to start building a few boreholes, if you like, digging a few boreholes into the terrain of your life. See who Jesus is. See what he's offering you. I know it's not going to be an easy choice, and you need to factor that in. But there are people in this room, people you know, whose lives are built on this man, Jesus. Ask them, talk to them, speak to people. There are podcasts and Bible verses, and you can ask anybody who's sitting in a yellow t-shirt to get you connected into a small group where you can ask questions. And we will be very soon having another Alpha where you can ask those questions, find out what the foundations would look like if Jesus was to build in your life. I've been a Christian a very long time, and I can tell you He is a sure and firm foundation. He will not let you down if you take a chance on him. Incredibly and wonderfully, anyone who makes a commitment to Jesus, whatever the wind blows in your life, whatever the storm looks like, you are secure in your eternal position. What you do about these parables is nothing to do with your salvation. It's about building your life as Jesus would have it. The Bible often talks about buildings and temples and houses, our lives being like that. So taking every parable, every teaching, everything that you've read in your Bible, allow Jesus to weave those designs into your life, because it's his intention that we one day will be presented at the end of all time as he, the master builder, would have us be. Glorious, magnificent, wonderful, authentic. Our lives changed, so we become a grand design for him to show his glory in and for him to dwell in. It's a glorious, a marvelous, an awesome parable, because it reminds us that we are built on a foundation that can never be changed. He is solid as a rock. Your house will not fall if you build on him. Would you allow me the privilege of praying for you, because what we have heard this morning is not an easy ask. But in Colossians it tells us this. Pray with me. God, I ask you to fill us with the knowledge of your will through all the wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives, so that we may live a life worthy of you, so that we may please you in every way, so that we can bear fruit in every glorious work, so that we can grow in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power to do what you've called us to do and to live as you have asked us. That you would give us great endurance and patience and joyful thanks, because you've qualified us to share in the inheritance of your holy people in the kingdom of light. You are awesome and amazing, Jesus, and we lift our eyes to you now and ask you to come again, to come and fill us with your Spirit, which will enable us to do what you've asked us to do.
You're like a circle that floats around me, keeping me safe and sound. And when I fall, you've tied a rope to me. You're blessing me every day.